My name is Kate Ball, 35 years old, a major in the U.S. Army Rangers. At my own welcome home party, the one that was supposed to be for me, my cousin Ryan held up his beer and announced to the 20 relatives and friends gathered in the backyard. A toast to Katie, fresh off her 6-month tour of filing papers in Germany. Must have been real tough stamping passports and making coffee for the colonels, huh? A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, strained but sharp enough to cut. My own mother quickly said, "Oh, Ryan, don't tease her." But her tone was one of pity, not defense. But the thing that killed me, the thing that really twisted the knife, was when Ryan turned to his own father, my Uncle Jack, a retired Navy SEAL legend, and said, "At least some of us in this family know what a real fight looks like, right, Dad?" And Uncle Jack just stayed silent, his eyes briefly flicking over to me, not offering a single word of protest. They didn't know that, deep in the pocket of my fatigues, was an ice-cold challenge coin, a gift from some of Uncle Jack's own brothers in arms. And they had no idea that his silence today would be the very thing that would make the truth explode later. If you've ever been made to feel like a joke by your own family, if your sacrifices have been treated as worthless, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe, because this is the story of how a Stonewall of silence finally found its voice. The air in Fairfax, Virginia, was thick with that late summer humidity that clings to your skin, heavy with the scent of charcoal and grilled meat. Uncle Jack's backyard was the quintessential American scene. A perfectly manicured lawn, kids chasing a football, and the low hum of cheerful conversation punctuated by the clinking of beer bottles. The sizzle and smoke of the barbecue should have felt welcoming, like coming home. But for me, it felt like walking onto a stage where I didn't know my lines. The greetings came in a flurry, warm but shallow. Quick, one-armed hugs from aunts and uncles, pats on the back from family friends. "Kate, good to have you back. You look great." It was all surface level, their eyes already scanning the yard for someone else to talk to. My Aunt Marianne, Ryan's mother, enveloped me in a cloud of perfume and scrutiny. She held me at arm's length, her perfectly manicured hands on my shoulders. "Oh, Katie, look at you. So thin and tan." It was meant as a compliment, I suppose, but all it did was reduce 6 months of grueling work, of long nights, heavy gear, and relentless pressure to a simple observation about my appearance. The reason I was thin and tan was irrelevant. Then came Ryan. He slung a heavy arm over my shoulders, his grip just a little too firm, a little too proprietary. He smelled of beer and the cheap cologne he'd worn since high school. "There she is," he boomed, turning me to face him. "Our little world traveler, how was the European tour? Get some good sightseeing in on the government's dime?" I forced a tight smile. "It wasn't a tour, Ryan. It was a deployment." He just chuckled, a dismissive sound that grated on my nerves. Right, a deployment." He said the word like it was a foreign delicacy he couldn't quite stomach. This was his stage, and he was the star. I was just a prop he used to make himself look better. The moment from the toast, the one that still burns in my memory, wasn't even the worst of it. It was just the opening act. A little while later, an old friend of my parents, a kind man named Mr. Henderson, actually tried to engage with me. "So, Kate," he asked, his eyes full of genuine curiosity, "what is it you actually do over there? It sounds very impressive." I felt a small spark of hope. Maybe someone here actually wanted to understand. I opened my mouth, ready to give him the simple, unclassified version. "Well, sir, I work with..." "Bottom line," Ryan's voice sliced through my sentence, sharp and loud. He stepped between me and Mr. Henderson, clapping the older man on the shoulder. "Bottom line, she sits behind a desk and makes sure the paychecks go out on time. Important work." He winked at the small group that had gathered, a smug, knowing little gesture that sealed my fate. He had just painted my entire career, my entire identity as a ranger, as a glorified payroll clerk. A few people chuckled nervously. My own parents, standing just a few feet away, just offered weak smiles and quickly changed the subject to the local high school's football prospects. No one corrected him, no one defended me. I was left standing there, stranded in a sea of smiling faces, suddenly feeling completely and utterly invisible. Later, as I was trying to blend into the background near the drink cooler, Aunt Marianne sidled up to me, her expression a practiced mask of concern. "Don't you mind him, sweetie," she whispered, patting my arm. "He just worries about you. A pretty girl like you should find a safe job, settle down and get married, not be running around in those places." The words were meant to be comforting, but they were just another form of dismissal, another way of saying that my life's work was nothing more than an inappropriate hobby for a pretty girl. My eyes scanned the yard, desperately searching for an anchor, and they landed on Uncle Jack. He was standing by the grill, a metal spatula in his hand, methodically flipping thick-cut steaks. The fire glowed against the dusk, casting his face in shadow and light. He was a legend, a man who had seen and done things most people only see in movies. He was the only one in this family who understood what the word ranger meant. He knew the training, the sacrifice, the grit it took. He knew, better than anyone, that I wasn't just stamping papers. Our eyes met for a brief second across the yard. I sent a silent plea, a desperate hope that he would say something, anything. A simple, "That's not what she does, Ryan," would have been enough. A look, a nod, anything to validate my existence in this world he understood so well. But he didn't. He just held my gaze for a moment, his expression unreadable, and then he looked down, focusing his attention back on the steaks. That was it. His silence was a verdict. It was louder than all of Ryan's insults combined. It was a quiet confirmation that, in his world of elite warriors, I didn't register. I wasn't worthy of his defense. The betrayal I felt in that moment was a physical thing, a cold weight that settled deep in my chest. My hero, my idol, had just let me drown. I didn't make a scene. Years of military discipline had taught me to control my emotions, to present a calm exterior even when my insides were screaming. I plastered a smile on my face, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes, and found my parents. "I'm exhausted from the flight," I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "I think I'm going to head out." They accepted the excuse easily, maybe even gratefully. No one tried to stop me. As I walked towards the gate, I could hear the laughter and conversation swelling behind me, the party carrying on as if I had never been there at all. My presence had just been a temporary, awkward pause in their regular programming. Sitting in the driver's seat of my car, parked down the street, I stared at my hands resting on the steering wheel. They were rough, the knuckles scarred, the palms calloused. These were the hands that had fired a rifle, that had applied a tourniquet to a bleeding comrade, that had dug foxholes in frozen ground. They had earned their roughness. They were a testament to who I was. And yet, in that house, in the place I was supposed to call home, they were worthless. The loop started then, replaying in my mind. Ryan's jeering voice, "Making coffee for the colonels, huh?" The sound of forced laughter, the sight of my parents looking away, and loudest of all, the deafening sound of Uncle Jack's silence as he flipped a steak. Why doesn't my truth carry any weight here? That question, why doesn't my truth carry any weight here? It didn't just appear out of nowhere that night in the car. It was an old question, a ghost that had been rattling around inside me for years. The welcome home party wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the latest chapter in a long, quiet story of being invisible. To understand that night, you have to understand the map of scars that led me there. My memories of growing up are like a series of sharp, fractured images, each one a small cut. I remember high school. Friday nights in our town were sacred. They belonged to football. And Ryan, my cousin, was the king of Friday nights. He was the star quarterback, the captain of the team, a local hero before he could even legally vote. Every one of his games was a full-blown family pilgrimage. My parents, my aunt and uncle, grandparents. Everyone would be there in the bleachers, wrapped in school colors, screaming his name until their voices were hoarse. After every win, there would be a massive party at his house, a victory barbecue that felt like a town holiday. Ryan would be carried through the crowd on his teammates' shoulders, a conquering hero. He was the embodiment of strength, of family pride. That same year, I was also on a team. I ran track. There were no roaring crowds for me, just the lonely rhythm of my own breathing and the pounding of my feet on the synthetic red track, day after day, before school and after. I poured everything I had into it, and I was good. I was more than good. I won the state championship in the 400-meter dash. It was the proudest moment of my young life. I remember driving home from the state meet, the gold medal heavy and cool against my chest. I walked into my aunt's house, where the family was gathered for Sunday dinner, and held it up for everyone to see. Aunt Marianne glanced at it briefly, a polite smile on her face. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she said, before turning her attention back to the pot roast. "Running is so good for your figure." And that was it. My victory, my months of discipline and pain, were reduced to a beauty tip. Ryan's touchdowns were symbols of honor and power. My gold medal was just good for my figure. I learned a valuable lesson that day. In our family, there was only one stage, and the spotlight was already taken. The Morrison house itself was a constant reminder of my place. It wasn't just a home, it was a museum, a shrine dedicated to my Uncle Jack's legacy. The living room walls were covered in it. Framed medals, the Navy Cross, the Silver Star, gleamed under the track lighting. A folded American flag that had flown over a base in some far-off desert sat in a triangular glass case on the mantel. Photos of Uncle Jack, young and formidable in his gear, surrounded by his SEAL team brothers, stared down from every wall. It was a temple to a god of war. And I always felt like an intruder there, a trespasser in a holy place. Ryan, who had never worn a uniform a day in his life, moved through that house like he was the heir to the throne. He would tell his father's war stories, our stories, he'd say, as if he'd been there himself. He'd pick up a piece of shrapnel mounted on a plaque and explain the firefight it came from with an air of authority. Once, he caught me staring at a team photo and said, with that condescending smirk of his, "You wouldn't get it, Katie. It takes a certain kind of person to be like my dad, a special breed." He was drawing a line in the sand, making it clear which side of the family carried that special breed gene. And it wasn't mine. The deepest cut, though, came during my senior year. My mother got sick. It was one of those illnesses that comes on fast and steals everything: her energy, her smile, her strength. The doctors said she needed round-the-clock care for a few months. Ryan was away at the University of Virginia, living the fraternity dream. My dad had to keep working 2 jobs to pay the bills, so the responsibility fell to me. I dropped off the track team. I turned down an athletic scholarship to a great school out of state. My world shrank to the 4 walls of our small house. I spent my days juggling homework, managing her medications, cooking meals, and driving her to endless doctor's appointments. Ryan would call home occasionally, his voice loud and cheerful over the phone from some party. "How's Aunt Carol doing?" he'd ask, a perfunctory question before launching into a story about his latest keg stand or a girl he was dating. He never once asked how I was doing. Months later, when my mom was finally back on her feet, we had a family get-together to celebrate. I remember standing in the kitchen, exhausted but relieved, feeling like I could finally breathe again. That's when Aunt Marianne raised her glass and said to the room, "I'm just so thankful Ryan got into UVA. He has such a bright future ahead of him." Everyone murmured in agreement. Not a single person mentioned what I had done. My sacrifice wasn't a bright future, it was just an expectation, an invisible duty that was performed and then forgotten. So when I finally graduated and told them my decision to enlist in the Army, I shouldn't have been surprised by their reaction. My announcement was met with a stunned, uncomfortable silence. Then Ryan let out a bark of laughter. "The Army?" he sneered, looking around the room for an audience. "Do they have a landscaping division? At least you're good at running in circles." His words hung in the air, cruel and sharp. But it was the silence of the adults that really did the damage. My dad, my quiet, gentle dad, just looked down at his plate. He never said a word against them, but later that night, I found a book left on my desk. It was a worn paperback titled "Women in the American Military." It was his silent way of saying, "I see you." It was a small act of rebellion, a quiet vote of confidence, but it was a whisper in a hurricane of disapproval. That moment, Ryan's cruel joke and the family's silent complicity was the final push I needed. It solidified a resolve deep inside me. I was done trying to earn their approval with words. I would prove them all wrong, not for them, but for me. I would build a life and an identity so strong, so undeniable, that not even their condescension could touch it. I would do something they could never trivialize again. Staring at my high school diploma that night, feeling the cheap paper in my hands, it felt like a certificate of invisibility. It represented 4 years of trying to measure up in a race I was never meant to win. What did any of it mean if the people who were supposed to love you most refused to see you? Staring at that high school diploma, I realized it wasn't a ticket to anywhere. It was a mirror reflecting a girl they refused to see. Years later, I found myself staring at another piece of paper. This one was different. It wasn't a reward for past achievements. It was a promise of a future I would forge for myself. It was an enlistment contract for the United States Army. It felt like the first real decision I had ever made. My journey began at Fort Benning, Georgia. Under a sun so merciless, it felt like it wanted to melt the very skin from your bones. Basic training was the great equalizer. It didn't matter who you were or where you came from. The drill sergeants broke you down into your component parts and rebuilt you into a soldier. But even in a place designed to erase individuality, I stood out. I was one of a handful of women in a company of over 200 men. From day one, I felt the weight of their skepticism. It wasn't overt hostility, not at first. It was in the small things. The way the drill sergeants would watch me a little longer during push-ups. The way the men in my platoon would hesitate before partnering with me on drills. I learned quickly that for them, passing was the standard. For me, passing wasn't enough. I had to excel just to be seen as competent. If they did 20 reps, I did 25. If they ran 2 miles, I pushed myself to run faster, harder. I operated on a 200% standard because I knew their 100% would never be good enough for me. Basic was just the appetizer. The main course, the one I had my sights set on from the beginning, was Ranger School. It's known as one of the toughest military courses in the world. A 62-day marathon of controlled starvation, sleep deprivation, and relentless physical and mental stress. It's where the Army finds its leaders. It's also where most people find their breaking point. The day I started Ranger School, I felt an entirely new level of isolation. The skepticism wasn't just quiet glances anymore, it was a palpable force. I wasn't just a woman, I was an experiment, a question mark in a sea of exclamation points. The mountain phase in the rugged terrain of northern Georgia was my personal hell. We were perpetually cold, perpetually wet, and perpetually hungry. The rucksack felt like it was fused to my spine, a 70-pound monster that became a part of me. We climbed sheer rock faces with frozen fingers, navigated through dense, dark forests on a single ration of food per day, and crossed rivers so cold they stole the breath from your lungs. There was one night, deep into a multi-day patrol, that I nearly broke. We were moving through a blizzard, the snow so thick I couldn't see the man 10 feet in front of me. Every muscle in my body was screaming in protest. My core temperature was dropping, and a dangerous lethargy was setting in. I stumbled and fell, my face hitting the snow with a soft thud. For a moment, I just lay there. It would be so easy to quit, so easy to just close my eyes and let the cold take over. Just give up, a voice whispered in my head. No one expects you to finish anyway. And then, clear as day, I saw 2 faces in my mind. The first was Ryan's, with that smug, condescending grin as he said, "Good at running in circles." The second was Uncle Jack's, his face impassive and silent as he turned his back on me. The thought of them being right, the thought of them nodding knowingly and saying, "See? We told you she couldn't do it," ignited something inside me. It wasn't just motivation. It was pure, unadulterated rage. That anger became fuel. It burned hotter than any fire, melting the exhaustion and the cold. I pushed myself up, my arms shaking, got my feet under me, and took one more step, and then another. That night, something shifted, not just in me, but in the men around me. Until then, They had called me by my last name, Ball, in that clipped, impersonal way soldiers do. But a few days later, during another long patrol, a guy in my squad named Miller twisted his ankle badly. He was a big guy, well over 200 pounds, and he couldn't put any weight on it. The platoon sergeant was about to have him medically evacuated, which would have meant he'd fail the course. Without a second thought, I walked over to him. "Give me your rifle and your pack," I said. He looked at me, his face etched with pain and surprise. I didn't wait for an answer. I took his M4, slung it over my shoulder, and then hoisted his rucksack, adding another 45 pounds of dead weight to my own burden. For the next 6 miles, I half carried, half dragged him over the rocky terrain until we reached our objective. I don't remember much about it, just the searing pain in my shoulders and the singular focus of putting one foot in front of the other. We made it. Later that night, huddled together for warmth, Miller turned to me. "Thanks, Kate," he said. It was the first time any of them had used my first name. It was a small word, but it was everything. It was respect. It was acceptance. It was a start. Graduation day was surreal. I stood on the field at Fort Benning, gaunt and 30 pounds lighter, but taller than I'd ever felt. I was one of only 3 women in my class to make it to the end. When the commanding general pinned the black and gold Ranger tab on my shoulder, he looked me dead in the eye. "Welcome to the regiment, Ranger," he said. His voice was gravelly, serious. In that moment, I knew I had found it. I had found my family. Not one of blood, but one of sweat, sacrifice, and shared respect. Later that day, I found a payphone and called home to share the news. My mom answered. "Mom, I did it," I said, my voice cracking with emotion. "I graduated. I'm a Ranger." There was a pause on the other end. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she finally said, her voice distant. "That's wonderful. Just make sure you're staying safe, okay?" I hung up the phone, the familiar ache of disappointment settling in. She didn't understand. She couldn't. How could she? The world I had just survived was a universe away from her quiet suburban life. And if you've ever had a moment like that, a moment where you achieved something monumental and the people you wanted to hear it from most just didn't get it, please hit that like button. Let me know I'm not alone. And in the comments, just type one word. I get it. Because sometimes that's all we need to hear. My real validation hadn't come through the phone line. It had come from the quiet nod of a general, the weight of the tab on my shoulder, and the sound of my own name, spoken with respect. My old Ranger instructor, a man who seemed to be carved from granite, found me after the ceremony. He shook my hand, his grip like iron. "You've earned the tab, Ball," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Now, let's see what you do with it." My Ranger instructor's words, "Let's see what you do with it," followed me across the world. They were a challenge, a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. I found the answer to his question halfway around the globe, in a place that God had seemingly forgotten, a place called the Korengal Valley. The soldiers who had been there before us had another name for it, the Valley of Bones. It was a jagged scar ripped through the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, a treacherous maze of rocky slopes and blind corners where the air itself felt hostile. Every rock looked like a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper of death. As a sergeant leading my own fire team, my job was to stay alert, to see the things others missed. And in the Korengal, there was always something to miss. Our mission was a joint recon patrol. My Ranger platoon was tasked with providing support and overwatch for a SEAL team that was moving deeper into the valley to scout a high-value target. The tension was a living thing. You could taste it in the dust that coated your tongue. We moved slowly, deliberately. The crunch of our boots on the loose gravel sounding like gunshots in the oppressive silence. Every step was a calculation of risk. And then, the world exploded. One moment, there was silence. The next, the valley erupted in a symphony of chaos. The crack of AK-47s echoed off the canyon walls, followed by the terrifying thump whoosh of an RPG. The SEALs, the tip of our spear, had walked straight into a perfectly executed L-shaped ambush. The radio in my ear became a fountain of pure panic. Contact front, contact right, we're taking heavy fire, 2 men down, we're pinned. The SEAL team leader's voice was strained, fighting to be heard over the cacophony of the firefight. They were trapped, caught in a kill zone with enemy fire raining down on them from the high ground on 3 sides. Our orders came down instantly, sharp and clear. My squad was to secure a strategic ridge to the west, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the SEALs' only viable path for retreat. It wasn't a glorious charge, it was a suicide mission. Our job was to become a target, to draw fire, to be the anvil so the SEALs could pull back before they were hammered into oblivion. We moved fast, adrenaline overriding the fear. We scrambled up the loose rock, the air around us alive with the angry buzz of bullets. We were just feet from the crest when I saw my squad leader, Sergeant Evans, jolt backward as if struck by an invisible fist. He went down hard, a dark stain spreading across his chest. No time to think, no time to mourn. In the chaos, a core piece of my training took over. In the storm, be the rock. The words of my ranger instructor echoed in my head. Without a conscious thought, I was in command. Get down! Find cover! I screamed, my voice cutting through the noise. I crawled to Evans, confirmed the worst, and grabbed his radio. Bravo 1 is down. Bravo 2 has command. We are on the ridge, taking fire. The next few minutes, or was it hours, were a blur of controlled violence. The training took over, my body moving like a well-oiled machine. I became a conductor of a deadly orchestra. Miller, suppressive fire on that outcrop, 2 o'clock. Diaz, you've got the ravine. Watch our flank. I crawled from position to position, dragging younger, terrified soldiers into better cover, pointing out targets, my voice the only anchor in their storm of fear. An RPG screamed past my head and slammed into the rocks behind me, showering us with stone fragments. A piece of shrapnel sliced into my left forearm, a sharp, searing pain. I ignored it. Pain was a luxury we couldn't afford. My world narrowed to 3 things: the position of my men, the position of the enemy, and the amount of ammunition we had left. We were a thin line of defiance against a tide of pure hatred. We held. We did not break. We became a wall of stone. From our vantage point, I could see the SEALs below, using the break we were giving them. They were pulling back, dragging their wounded, laying down their own covering fire. They were professionals, the best of the best, and they were retreating because we were doing our job, because our wall was holding. I don't know how long we held that ridge. Time ceased to have meaning. But eventually, the roar of attack helicopters echoed through the valley, and the enemy fire began to slacken. The storm had broken. The silence that followed was more deafening than the battle itself. In the aftermath, as the dust settled and the medevacs landed, the reality of what happened began to sink in. We had casualties. We had lost good men. But we had held the line. A few days later, back at the forward operating base, one of the SEALs from the ambush came to find me. He was a giant of a man, with a thick, wild beard and eyes that had seen too much. I expected him to talk to our platoon leader, but he walked straight up to me. He didn't say much. He just reached out, took my hand, and gave it a firm, solid squeeze. His thumb pressed against the bandage on my forearm. "Thank you, Ranger," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You saved my brothers." That was it. No medals, no ceremony, just a quiet acknowledgement from one warrior to another. It was worth more than any award they could ever give me. Weeks later, I got a rare call on the satellite phone. It was Uncle Jack. His voice was casual, asking the usual questions about the food and the weather. But there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. He knew something. The special operations community is a small world. Word travels fast. "Stay safe over there, Kate," he said before hanging up. There was a pause. People are talking. My blood ran cold. He knew. He had heard the story from his SEAL contacts. He knew what had happened on that ridge. He knew about Sergeant Evans. He knew that I had taken command, that I had held the line. He knew everything. And in that moment, I also knew something else with a chilling certainty. He would never tell them. He would never tell Ryan or Aunt Marianne or my parents. My moment of trial by fire, the day I earned my place, would remain a classified secret back home. It would be buried under the weight of their assumptions, hidden behind the caricature of the girl who was good at running in circles. The heroic truth of what happened in the Valley of Bones would be my burden to carry alone. I looked down at my arm, at the small jagged line of the healing wound. It was a souvenir from the day I became Stonewall. A permanent reminder of a battle won on two fronts, one on a dusty ridge in Afghanistan, and another, quieter one, that I was still fighting all by myself. That small jagged scar on my forearm became a private symbol. To the world, it was just a minor wound. To me, it was a piece of the Korengal Valley I would carry forever. A physical reminder of the truth Uncle Jack and I now shared in silence. At home, back in the quiet rhythm of stateside life, I found myself touching it unconsciously. The raised skin a connection to a reality that felt a million miles away. It was a truth no one else in my family knew or cared to know. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen with Aunt Mary Ann, and she noticed it. She reached out, her fingers gently prodding the scar. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice dripping with cosmetic concern. "You should really put some concealer on that, dear. Scars aren't very ladylike." I just stared at her, my mind flashing back to the scream of the RPG, the smell of cordite, the weight of a dying man's radio in my hand. Ladylike. The word was so absurd, so completely disconnected from my reality, that I couldn't even form a response. I just pulled my arm back and said nothing. That conversation was a perfect prelude to what came next. A few months after I got back from Afghanistan, my phone rang. It was Aunt Marianne. Her voice was an octave higher than usual, a syrupy sweet tone she reserved for when she wanted something. "Katie, darling, how are you?" she chirped. "I was just thinking about you. We're all so proud of your service, you know." I gripped the phone a little tighter. The word proud felt so hollow coming from her lips. "I'm fine, Aunt Marianne. What's up?" After a few more minutes of painfully hollow pleasantries, she got to the point. "Well, dear, it's about Ryan." Of course it was. "He's applying for a wonderful new job with a very prestigious private security firm, a real leadership position. And they require a letter of recommendation from a military officer." A cold stillness settled over me. I knew exactly where this was going. "Your Uncle Jack is retired now, you know," she continued, her voice becoming even more conspiratorial and sweet. "And a letter from an active duty officer, well, that just carries so much more weight. All you'd have to do is write a few nice lines about his iron discipline and natural leadership qualities. Something like that. You're the soldier in the family. They'll believe anything you write." I was speechless. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it stole my breath. The same career she had dismissed as unladylike, the same service Ryan had publicly mocked as a coffee-fetching joke, was now a tool they wanted to use for his advancement. They wanted me to take the credibility I'd earned with my own blood and sweat and gift it to the very person who had tried to strip me of it. They wanted me to lie. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady and professional. "Aunt Marianne," I said, my tone flat. "I can't do that. I can't write about qualities in Ryan that I've never personally witnessed." The sweetness in her voice vanished, replaced by a sharp, offended chill. "Well, I never. It's a simple family favor, Catherine. I don't see why you have to be so difficult." She hung up before I could reply. A few days later, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Ryan. His approach was different, but no less insulting. No more jokes, just the condescending tone of a king bestowing a favor upon a court jester. "Hey, heard you talk to my mom. Don't be so self-righteous. It's just a little favor. It's good for the family. When I make it big, you'll look good too." I read the message 3 times. "You'll look good too." He genuinely believed he was doing me a favor. He was offering me a chance to ride his coattails, the coattails I was expected to stitch for him. It was then I realized the true depth of his delusion. He saw nothing wrong with his past behavior, no hypocrisy in his current request. In his mind, he was the golden boy. And it was my duty, my privilege to help polish his crown. The whole situation left a bitter taste in my mouth. That evening, I called my dad. As always, he listened patiently, the silence on his end of the line a comforting presence. I told him about Aunt Marianne's call, about Ryan's text. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. He didn't tell me what to do. He never did. But what he said next has stayed with me ever since. Sometimes, he said, his voice heavy with a quiet sorrow, in the name of keeping the peace, we let poisonous trees grow too tall, Kate. Eventually, their roots will crack the very foundation of the house. It was the closest he had ever come to admitting it, admitting that their generation's desire to avoid conflict, to placate and enable, had allowed Ryan's toxic entitlement to fester and grow, unchecked. He was admitting their failure. In the midst of this simmering tension, the email arrived. The subject line was bright and cheerful. "You're invited, Ryan and Tiffany's engagement party." My stomach clenched. It was going to be another barbecue in Uncle Jack's backyard. The same stage, the same audience, the same actors. They were asking me to walk right back into the lion's den, to sit there and smile while they celebrated the man who had torn me down and then tried to use me as a stepping stone. I was trapped. If I went and said nothing, I would be complicit in my own erasure. My silence would be taken as forgiveness, as an endorsement of the status quo. It would give Ryan a blank check to continue treating me as worthless. But if I didn't go, I'd be the villain. I'd be the jealous cousin, the bitter spinster raining on their parade. They would paint me as petty and vindictive, proving their twisted narrative about me. I stared at the email on my screen, the cursor blinking hypnotically. The whole world seemed to shrink down to that single, flashing line. For years, I had retreated. I had endured. I had built a new life, a new identity, thousands of miles away, only to find the same old battle waiting for me right here at home. But this time felt different. My dad's words about the poisonous tree echoed in my head. The foundation was already cracking. Running wasn't an option anymore. This party, this barbecue, wasn't just a social gathering. It was going to be a battlefield. And this time, I was choosing to fight. My finger hovered over the reply button, my resolve hardening into something cold and sharp. I was done being the quiet, accommodating niece. I was done being the family's punching bag. I would go to their party. But I wouldn't be going to keep the peace. I clicked RSVP, attending, and closed my laptop. The decision was made. There would be no more retreating. I spent the next few days in a state of calm resolve. It felt like the hours before a mission. The quiet focus, the mental preparation, the acceptance of the coming conflict. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply ready. When I pulled up to Uncle Jack's house, it was like stepping into a time loop. Same manicured lawn, same smell of barbecue, same cast of characters. Ryan was, as always, the center of the universe. He stood near the deck, a beer in one hand, his other arm draped possessively around his fiancée, Tiffany. He was holding court, telling some loud, exaggerated story about his new job, his voice booming across the yard. He saw me arrive, gave me a curt, dismissive nod, and then turned back to his audience. It was a clear message. You are irrelevant here. I didn't try to engage. I got a glass of iced tea and found a quiet spot, becoming an observer. I saw my parents hovering near the edge of the crowd, looking uncomfortable, as they always did in the shadow of the Morrison clan. I saw Aunt Marianne fluttering around like a proud peacock, touching Ryan's arm every few minutes as if to remind everyone that this masterpiece was her creation. And I saw Uncle Jack stationed at the grill, his face thoughtful and hard to read as he expertly managed the flames. There was a fragile, paper-thin layer of celebration stretched over a deep well of tension. I could feel it. For about an hour, the play continued as scripted. Then, Ryan, his confidence inflated by a few beers, decided it was time for his favorite scene, the public belittling of his cousin Katie. He led Tiffany by the hand over to where I was standing. She was exactly the type I'd expected, perfectly coiffed, wearing a sundress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. She looked me up and down, a quick dismissive appraisal from my worn-in boots to my plain ponytail. "Tiffany, this is my cousin Kate," Ryan said, his tone dripping with condescension. "The one I told you about, the career soldier." Tiffany's smile tightened. "Oh, right," she said, her voice a high, chirpy sound that grated on my nerves. "I hear you're in the army. That's interesting. I guess you must be pretty used to taking orders then?" My Ryan, he was just born to give them. That was it. That was the line. It wasn't just an insult. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of everything I was. It was the casual dismissal of my entire life's work, of my rank, of the men and women I had led. Ryan roared with laughter, a triumphant braying sound. He clapped me hard on the shoulder. "See? Even Tiffany gets it. Some people are born to follow, and some are born to lead." He stared right at me, a challenge glittering in his eyes, waiting for the familiar, tight-lipped smile, waiting for me to absorb the blow and retreat, as I always had. But this time, the wall he was pushing against didn't budge. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, I set my glass of iced tea down on a nearby table. The soft clink of glass on wood was barely audible, but in the sudden pocket of silence that had fallen around us, it sounded like a gunshot. A few heads turned our way. I raised my eyes and met his. My voice, when it came out, wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It was low, calm, and as cold and sharp as honed steel. "You're right, Ryan," I said. "Some people are born to lead." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "The problem is, you've never led anything but your own cheering section." The effect was instantaneous. The air crackled and froze. Tiffany's perfectly painted mouth dropped open. The color drained from Ryan's face, then rushed back in a hot, blotchy tide of red. His bravado crumbled, replaced by pure, sputtering disbelief. What did you just say?" he stammered, his voice a fraction of its former volume. "You heard me," I said, my voice gaining strength with every word, steady and unwavering now. The years of suppressed anger, of swallowed insults, were finally being forged into something solid, something powerful. You wear the military-style t-shirts from the mall. You talk the talk you learned from your father's stories, but you have never been anywhere near the fire. You want to talk about leadership? You wouldn't know the first thing about it. I took a step closer, lowering my voice even more, forcing him to lean in. "You made a joke about my nickname at my own welcome home party. You want to know where it came from? You want to know how you get a name like that?" I held his stunned gaze. "Fine. They call me Stonewall. It was given to me by men whose lives depended on my leadership. It was earned with blood and sweat on a rocky ridge in the Korengal Valley. And that is not a name that you, or your fiancé, ever get to make jokes about again." Every word was a hammer blow, dismantling the carefully constructed facade of his superiority. A complete, dead silence had fallen over the entire backyard. Everyone was staring, their faces a mixture of shock and fascination. The party was over. The play had been canceled. My gaze flickered past Ryan to the grill. To Uncle Jack. He had stopped flipping the steaks. The spatula was held motionless in his hand. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes, those piercing blue seal eyes, were locked on me. I saw something in them I'd never seen before. Not pity, not condescension, but a flicker of recognition. Slowly, deliberately, he put the spatula down. He turned his gaze from me to his son, who was still standing there, utterly defeated and speechless. The silence stretched for an eternity. And I want to ask you, have you ever had a moment where you finally spoke your truth, and the entire world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next? If you know that feeling, that terrifying, liberating feeling, do me a favor and hit the like button for every single person who has ever had to fight to be heard. And in the comments, just write 2 simple words. I'm here. Let's show each other that we're not alone in these battles. Uncle Jack took a step forward, away from the grill. He walked past the stunned guests, his movements calm and purposeful. He didn't stop until he was standing right between me and Ryan. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at his son, his golden boy. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, but it carried the unmistakable weight of command. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed without question. It was a voice that could cut through the noise of a firefight or the roar of a helicopter. And in the dead silence of that backyard, it sounded like thunder. "Son," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "Apologize, now." Uncle Jack's command, "Apologize, now," hung in the unnaturally still air of the backyard. For a split second, I saw a flicker of the old Ryan, the defiant, entitled prince of this family. He turned to his father, his face a mask of indignation. "Dad, come on, I was just kidding around," he whined, his voice cracking. "She's totally overreacting." "I wasn't asking." Uncle Jack cut him off, his voice dropping another 10 degrees, becoming lethally calm. That was an order. And just like that, the entire dynamic of our family, a structure that had been fixed in place for 35 years, shattered. It was no longer a father talking to his son. It was a commanding officer addressing a subordinate who had just crossed a line. The sizzle of the steaks on the forgotten grill was suddenly the loudest sound in the world. Every guest, every family member was frozen in place, their drinks halfway to their lips, their conversations dead. They were all witnesses now, no longer just party guests. They were watching the public court-martial of Ryan Morrison. Uncle Jack took one more step, positioning himself directly between us, a human wall separating Ryan's world from mine. He still didn't look at me. His focus was entirely on his son, his eyes like blue steel chips. And then, he began to speak. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the silent yard with absolute authority. "You like to tell my stories, Ryan," he began, his tone deceptively conversational. "You like to talk about the teams, about what it takes, but you don't know. You have no idea." He gestured vaguely toward the east. "There's a place in Afghanistan called the Korangal Valley. We call it the Valley of Bones for a reason. Not long ago, a SEAL team, friends of mine, men I served with, walked into a trap there. A perfectly planned ambush. They were pinned down, outgunned, taking casualties, with minutes left before they were completely overrun." He paused, letting the grim reality of his words sink in. I could see the guests leaning forward, their faces pale. Tiffany looked horrified. "High Command sent in a Ranger squad to secure their only way out," he continued. "A single ridge line. It was a suicide run. Their job was to draw fire, to become the target so that my friends, my brothers, could pull their wounded out and have a chance to live. Minutes after they reached that ridge, their squad leader was killed." I felt a collective gasp from the small crowd. My mother brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. Uncle Jack's voice dropped, becoming thick with an emotion I had never heard from him before. With their leader down and enemy fire coming from 3 sides, a young sergeant took command. A sergeant who refused to let her squad break. A sergeant who moved through hellfire to reposition her soldiers, to direct their fire, to keep them in the fight while wounded. He finally turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the crowd until it landed on an older man standing near the deck. A man with a weathered face and a Marine Corps tattoo faded on his forearm. "My friend Pat here," Uncle Jack said, his voice ringing with authority. "He's a retired gunnery sergeant. He's heard the stories coming out of the community. He's heard of Stonewall. Haven't you, Pat?" The man named Pat, who had been watching with intense focus, gave a slow, solemn nod. "I have, Jack," he affirmed, his voice raspy but clear. "We all have." That confirmation sent another shockwave through the yard. This wasn't just Uncle Jack's story anymore. It was real. It was known. It was a legend. Uncle Jack turned his full attention back to his son, whose face had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. "She held," he said, his voice rising, resonating with a terrible power. "She kept her soldiers alive and fighting. She turned them into a wall of stone the enemy could not break. Because of that wall, my men had a path to withdraw. They pulled 3 wounded men out of that kill zone, men who are alive today because that sergeant and her squad refused to yield an inch of that ridge." He took a final menacing step toward his son, who actually flinched and took a step back. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You just stood here, in my home, and you disrespected a person who saved the lives of men I call my brothers. You and your fiancé made a joke about taking orders and giving them. He let out a short, harsh laugh that had no humor in it. You've never given an order in your life that mattered. Her orders saved lives. He let the silence hang for a moment, a crushing, suffocating weight. Then he delivered the final, fatal blow. Stonewall isn't a nickname, Ryan, he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. It's a debt paid in blood. Ryan's world didn't just crack, it disintegrated. I watched the confident, arrogant man I had known my entire life crumble into a boy. The bravado, the entitlement, the smug superiority, it all vanished, burned away by the fiery truth. He stood there, exposed and humiliated, stripped bare in front of his friends, his family, and the woman he was supposed to marry. Tiffany stared at him, her pretty face a mask of revulsion, as if she was seeing him for the first time and didn't like what she saw. She took a half step away from him, a small but definitive act of separation. Aunt Marianne looked like she was going to be sick, her face ashen. And all around the yard, the faces that had once held laughter and derision now held a completely different expression. It was awe. It was respect. And in some of them, I saw a flicker of fear. They weren't looking at Katie anymore. They were looking at a stranger, a woman they didn't know at all. Ryan stood trembling, unable to meet his father's relentless gaze. The weight of that gaze finally broke him. He turned to me, his eyes downcast, fixed on the grass between our feet. He couldn't look at me. The golden boy, the hero, the king of the family, was finally brought to his knees, not by a weapon, but by the truth. He mumbled, his voice a choked, pathetic sound. I'm sorry. Ryan's choked apology seemed to sever the last thread holding the party together. The aftermath was not loud or dramatic. It was a slow, awkward disintegration. People suddenly remembered they had early mornings or babysitters to relieve. They offered quiet, hasty goodbyes, their eyes avoiding mine, avoiding Ryan's, avoiding Uncle Jack's. It was a mass exodus fueled by discomfort. Within 15 minutes, the bustling backyard was nearly empty. Ryan and a shell-shocked Tiffany had vanished into the house, swallowed by the shadows. My own parents gave me a wide-eyed, helpless look before murmuring their goodbyes and retreating to their car, clearly overwhelmed and unequipped to handle the fallout. I stood alone by the now empty drink table, the adrenaline from the confrontation draining away, leaving behind a strange and profound emptiness. I had won. I had spoken my truth, and it had been validated in the most spectacular way possible, but there was no elation, no triumphant joy. There was only a bone-deep weariness, the exhaustion of a soldier after a long and costly battle. I picked up my car keys from the table, ready to make my own escape. The fight was over. It was time to leave the battlefield. Kate, wait! Uncle Jack's voice cut through the quiet. He was still standing by the grill, now a cold, dark monolith in the fading light. We need to talk. I hesitated, my hand on the gate latch. Part of me wanted to just walk away, to leave all this wreckage behind. But I knew he was right. I turned and walked back toward him. He gestured to 2 folding chairs near the darkened grill. We sat in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant whine of traffic. He didn't look at me. He stared out into the darkness of his perfect lawn, his jaw tight. I'm sorry, he finally said, his voice low and gravelly. The words sounded like they were being pulled from somewhere deep and painful. And I don't mean for Ryan. He's got to own what he did. He has to live with that. I'm sorry for me. For my silence. I remained quiet, letting him speak. This was his confession, not mine. I've known the story for years, Kate, he admitted, his gaze still fixed on some distant point. The real story. I heard it through the community, from some of the guys on that SEAL team. They told me what happened on that ridge. He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were filled with a profound, weary sadness. I didn't say anything, and I don't have a good excuse. Part of it was trying to protect my son from a truth I knew would gut him. Part of it was, I don't know, a stupid hope that he'd grow up on his own, that he'd figure things out. He shook his head, a gesture of self-disgust. I was wrong, he said, his voice raw. Completely wrong. My silence enabled him. It let him live in a fantasy world where he was the hero and you were the punchline. And that hurt you. It was a failure of leadership. It was a failure as a man. And it was a failure as your uncle. And for that, I am truly sorry. The apology was so direct, so stripped of any excuse, that it disarmed me completely. It was the apology of a man who understood the weight of his own actions. He reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out something heavy. He placed it on the small table between us with a solid, metallic thud. This is yours, he said. I looked down. It was a challenge coin, thick and heavy, made of antique brass. On one side was the trident insignia of a top-tier SEAL team. I flipped it over. The other side was engraved with two simple lines, Korengal Valley and the date of the battle. Their team leader, a Master Chief I've known for 20 years, asked me to find you, Uncle Jack explained, his voice quiet. He gave this to me the last time I saw him. He said it's the highest sign of respect a SEAL can give an Army soldier. He wanted to make sure you got it. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. He told me, find her. Tell her Alpha Team will never forget what she did. They didn't call you Ball, Kate. They didn't call you Sergeant. They called you Stonewall. To them, that's who you are. I picked up the coin. It was heavy in my palm, cool to the touch. It was more than a medal. Medals are given by institutions, by generals in formal ceremonies. This was different. This was a tribute from the men I had helped save. This was a piece of their world, their culture, their respect, given freely. It was a tangible piece of the truth, something that couldn't be twisted or joked about or ignored. It was real. Holding it, I felt the last of the anger, the last of the bitterness that had been my constant companion for so many years, finally begin to dissolve. It was replaced by something else, something quiet and solid. I looked up at the man sitting across from me. For the first time, I didn't see the family patriarch, the Navy SEAL legend, the father of my arrogant cousin. I saw a man, a fellow soldier, who had failed in his duty and was now trying, in the only way he knew how, to make it right. In his eyes, I no longer saw judgment or distance. I saw pure, unvarnished respect. Thank you, Jack, I said. The name felt right. The title, Uncle, belonged to a different relationship, to a past that no longer existed. We were not family in that moment. We were two veterans, sitting in the quiet aftermath, acknowledging a debt. I closed my hand around the coin, the sharp edges of the insignia pressing into my palm. Its weight was a comfort, an anchor. It was the truth I could hold in my hand, a silent testament to a day when I had been tested and had not been found wanting. It was a reminder that my value was never up for debate by people who didn't understand the price. I drove away from Uncle Jack's house that night with the challenge coin heavy in my pocket. Its weight was a constant, grounding presence. The explosion was over, the battle won. What was left was the deafening silence of the aftermath and the slow, arduous task of clearing the rubble. The shockwaves from that party radiated outwards, cracking the foundations of our family in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. The first tremor came a few days later. My phone rang, and the caller ID read, Aunt Marianne. I almost didn't answer, but some morbid curiosity made me press the green button. I was met not with an apology, but with a storm of hysterical, weeping accusations. Catherine, do you see what you've done? She shrieked, her voice thick with tears that held no remorse, only rage. Our family is ruined, it's all your fault. Ryan and Tiffany, they called off the wedding, all because of your selfishness. If you had just kept your mouth shut, none of this would have ever happened. I listened to her tirade, my mind strangely calm. The old Kate would have been crushed by those words. The old Kate would have felt a familiar pang of guilt, a reflexive need to apologize, to smooth things over. But the woman holding the phone now was different. I let her finish, let her exhaust her arsenal of blame. When she finally paused to take a ragged breath, I spoke, my voice even and devoid of emotion. "Aunt Marianne," I said, "Ryan is 34 years old, and I'm no longer responsible for his feelings or for the consequences of his actions." Before she could launch into another volley of insults, I pressed the end call button. It was a simple act, just the touch of a finger on a screen, but it felt monumental. It was the sound of a boundary being drawn, clear and firm, a line she would not be allowed to cross again. The next piece of news came from my dad a few weeks later during one of our quiet weekly calls. He told me that Ryan's life was imploding. Tiffany had left him the day after the party. The prestigious job offer at the security firm had been mysteriously rescinded after word of his public humiliation got around. For the first time in his life, the golden ticket of being Commander Morrison's son was not only worthless, it was a liability. According to my dad, Ryan had hit rock bottom. He'd moved out of his parents' house and into a small apartment across town. He was working a regular job, something in sales, and had started seeing a therapist. A part of me should have felt a sense of victory, of schadenfreude. But I didn't. I just felt a quiet, detached sadness. His fall from grace wasn't a triumph. It was just a tragedy that had taken far too long to arrive. He was finally being forced to confront the man in the mirror without the flattering light of his father's shadow. Amidst the wreckage of the Morrison clan, something unexpected began to grow in the quiet soil of my own immediate family. My relationship with my parents started to change. The conversations became real. They started asking questions they'd never asked before. Not just, "Are you safe?" but, "What is it like? Who are the people you serve with? What are their names?" They stopped avoiding the core of who I was and started trying, awkwardly at first, to understand it. During one call, my mother's voice grew quiet, thick with an unfamiliar vulnerability. "I'm so sorry, honey," she said, and I could hear the genuine regret in her voice. "I was always so afraid of conflict, so afraid of making waves with Jack and Marianne, that I forgot my most important job was to protect you." Those simple words of confession, of accountability, meant more to me than 1,000 flowery apologies. It was the beginning of a healing I didn't even know I needed. The cracks in our own foundation began to mend. My bond with Jack solidified into something new and profound. We started talking regularly. We'd discuss military strategy, world politics, the challenges of leadership. He never offered unsolicited advice, but he listened. He understood the language I spoke, the world I lived in. He became the mentor I'd always craved, a source of quiet strength and wisdom. But I erected a wall around the rest of the Morrisons. The invitations to Thanksgiving and Christmas still came, first from my aunt, then from a grandmother, but I politely declined them all. I needed space. I needed peace. The price of admission to their family gatherings was silence and complicity, and I was no longer willing to pay it. I was learning that forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. It isn't about pretending the wound never happened. For me, forgiveness was about letting go of the anger that was poisoning me, not them. And letting go sometimes means letting the relationship go too. It means creating distance not as a punishment, but as an act of self-preservation. My dad, in his simple wisdom, had read me a verse from Psalms once, one that he loved. "Be still and know that I am God." I had reinterpreted it for myself. Be still and know your own worth. One evening, I was scrolling through my phone contacts, doing some digital housekeeping. I saw Aunt Marianne. I thought of her tearful, blaming phone call. I thought of all the years of dismissive comments and fake smiles. Without a moment's hesitation, I pressed her name and tapped Delete Contact. A small, clean act, a final boundary. Then my thumb hovered over Ryan's name. I thought of the boy who had raced me to the oak tree in our grandparents' yard. I thought of the man who had torn me down to build himself up. I thought of the text message, dripping with arrogance, and then I thought of what my dad had said. About him seeing a therapist, about him finally facing himself. I remembered the choked, pathetic sound of his apology in the backyard. My finger stayed there, hovering over the screen, suspended between deletion and preservation. I didn't know which one was the right choice. I didn't know if he was capable of change, or if some poisons just run too deep. For the first time in a long time, when it came to Ryan, I felt nothing, just a quiet, uncertain stillness. So I did nothing. I locked my phone and set it aside, leaving his name and number suspended in a digital limbo, a question mark I wasn't ready to answer. For years, Ryan's contact information sat untouched in my phone, a digital ghost I chose to ignore. Life moved on, as it always does. I rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a lieutenant colonel with a battalion of my own Rangers to lead. I found my purpose not in battle, but in mentorship, in shaping the next generation of soldiers. I guided young officers, both men and women, telling them what my old instructor had told me: earn your place, then make it matter. My life was full. It was meaningful. The wounds of the past had scarred over, becoming a part of my history, but no longer a source of daily pain. Then, one cool autumn afternoon, a text message lit up my screen from that dormant number. "Kate, it's Ryan. I know it's been a long time. I'm back in Fairfax for Thanksgiving. If you're in town, I'd really like to talk. No pressure if not. I'd understand." I stared at the message, that old, familiar uncertainty flickering for a moment before extinguishing. The question mark I had left hanging all those years ago was finally demanding an answer. I took a breath and typed back a simple reply: "I'll be there. Name the time and place." He chose his father's backyard, the old battlefield. When I arrived on Thanksgiving morning, he was waiting for me alone, standing near the now empty space where the grill used to be. The man who met me was not the boy I remembered. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet stillness. The smug grin had softened into a gentle, hesitant smile. He was older, his face carrying new lines of maturity, and, I thought, a hint of sorrow. He was married now, to a kind-looking woman I'd later meet named Sarah, and they had a young son. We sat in the same folding chairs where Jack and I had our talk years ago. For a long moment, we just sat in a comfortable silence, listening to the rustle of the fall leaves. He was the first to speak, and he didn't waste time with small talk. He turned to me, his eyes clear and direct, holding my gaze without flinching. "I was a real bastard, Kate," he said, his voice steady. "And I'm sorry." It was the same phrase he'd mumbled years ago, but the words were entirely different. The first apology had been forced from him, a product of shame and fear. This one was an offering, a quiet admission of a truth he had come to on his own. "I spent years in therapy trying to understand why I was the way I was," he continued, his gaze drifting across the yard, as if seeing ghosts of parties past. "And it always came back to you, and my dad. Looking at you, I saw everything I wasn't. You were tough, you were disciplined, you had this quiet strength. You earned everything you got. I was just coasting on my father's name, terrified that one day everyone would find out I was a fraud. And instead of trying to be better myself, I chose the easy way out. I chose to tear you down. It was cowardly, it was pathetic, and I am truly, deeply sorry for all the pain I caused you." I listened, and I saw the sincerity etched on his face. I saw the years of difficult self-reflection it must have taken to arrive at that honest place. The anger I'd once felt toward him was long gone, and in its place, I found an unexpected sense of peace. "I accept your apology, Ryan," I said, and I meant it. He told me about his life, about the long road back from hitting rock bottom. He told me about his work. He had started volunteering for a nonprofit organization that helps Ranger veterans transition back to civilian life. He used his business skills to help them with job placement, financial planning, and navigating the VA system. "I finally realized something," he said with a wry, self-deprecating smile. "I can't be you. I don't have what it takes. I'm not a warrior. But I realized I can use the skills I do have to serve people like you. It's my way of honoring what you do, of trying to build something good out of all the crap I created." He had found his own way to serve, not with a rifle, but with a spreadsheet. Not on a battlefield, but in a quiet office. He was no longer trying to wear his father's armor. He was finally comfortable in his own skin. I felt a surge of something I never thought I'd feel for him. Pride. As we were talking, a small boy with a mop of sandy hair came barreling out of the back door, running straight for his father. He was wearing a tiny olive drab t-shirt with the Ranger tab insignia printed on the front. Ryan's face lit up. He scooped the boy into his arms. "Hey, buddy. Easy there." He smiled at me. "Kate, this is my son, Evan." Then he looked at the boy. "Evan, this is your Aunt Kate." The little boy, who couldn't have been more than 4, squirmed to get down. He stood in front of me and looked up, his eyes wide with an undisguised, almost reverent awe. Then, with all the seriousness a 4-year-old could muster, he brought his small hand up to his forehead in a clumsy but deeply respectful salute. I was so surprised I could only stare back at him, a lump forming in my throat. I looked at Ryan, a question in my eyes. A genuine, proud smile spread across Ryan's face. He looked from his son back to me, and his voice was full of a warmth I had never heard before. "He knows who Stonewall is," he said softly. And in that moment, under the pale November sky, in the very place where I had once felt so broken and alone, everything came full circle. The healing was complete. The respect I had fought so hard for, the identity I had forged in fire and silence, was no longer something I had to defend. It was now a story being passed down with pride. It was a legacy. The name Stonewall was no longer a secret. It wasn't a burden. It had become a lesson in courage, a piece of family history taught to the next generation. It was a bridge, built from the rubble of the past, strong enough for a little boy to stand on as he looked up at his aunt with admiration in his eyes. And that was a victory greater than any I had ever known. That little boy's salute was the end of a war I didn't even know I was still fighting. It taught me that our true legacy isn't written in medals or carved on monuments. It's in the stories we have the courage to live and the lessons we pass on to the ones we love. My story found its piece, and I hope, in sharing it, you found a piece of your own. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us share more stories of resilience and hope. Thank you for listening.